Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors, Voice of Corporate Governance. I'm Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. The purpose of these monthly episodes is to update CII members and the general public on significant developments in corporate governance and capital markets regulation and CII's related advocacy activities. This update covers a period from June 30th to August 4th, 2025. The following is my top 10 list of events over that period. Number 10, on July 29th, state financial officers from 26 states sent letters to the chairs and CEOs of BNY Mellon, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Fidelity Investments, State Street, and Vanguard. The letters say that if the asset managers want to continue to do business in their states, they should take the following 5 steps to reaffirm and operationalize their commitment to traditional fiduciary duty. 1. Abandon the practice of framing deterministic future outcomes as long-term risks to justify immediate ideological interventions through corporate engagement or proxy voting. The letter says climate change is a common example of this, where potential risks, often uncertain and already accounted for in insurance and financial markets, are framed as certain and catastrophic to justify forcing companies to take immediate actions that may not align with their long-term business interests. 2, commit to not using passive investment vehicles for activist proxy voting or corporate engagement. Passive investing is designed to provide economic benefits of shareholder ownership as reflected in price appreciation over time. Using that ownership position to actively influence company behavior beyond material and relatively short-term financial considerations breaches the expectations of millions of Americans who selected these vehicles for broad market exposure and low cost. 3, commit to abstaining from embedding international political agendas such as net zero climate mandates, natural capital frameworks, or the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive into investment strategies and corporate engagement. 4, have clear and transparent proxy voting guidelines and stewardship practices that reflect a singular focus on shareholder value. Voting decisions and corporate engagement must be aligned with shareholder value, not environmental or social goals. And 5, fully disclose all affiliations and collaborative initiatives that could influence investment strategy or engagement priorities. The letter says our responsibility is to ensure public assets are managed in the best financial interest of beneficiaries and taxpayers. The letter adds, we expect detailed evidence that your firm's investment practices, proxy voting, and corporate engagement behavior and institutional affiliations align with traditional fiduciary standards as widely understood as short as 10 years ago and comply with applicable state laws. State officials ask the asset managers to reply to their letter by September 1st. Number 9, on July 17th, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, sent a letter to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, urging him to have the Financial Stability Oversight Council provide information and analysis on the extent to which non-bank financial companies' involvement in the private credit market and core banking system pose a threat to U.S. financial stability. Senator Warren also requested that the Financial Stability Oversight Council work with the Office of Financial Research to conduct a stress test of non-bank financial institutions engaged in private credit activities. The defined benefit funds of the 200 largest U.S. retirement plans reported $198.4 billion in private credit assets as of September 30th, 2024, up 57.2% from $126.2 billion a year prior, reports pension and investments. Private credit has seen a huge leap in recent years from only $26 billion 5 years ago, according again to pension and investments. Senator Warren's letter states that the $1.7 trillion private credit market has grown rapidly in recent years, including a 145% increase in the volume of bank loans to private debt funds. Senator Warren's letter warns that this growth could have significant implications for the stability of the financial system and health of the broader economy. Senator Warren's letter also points to a 2024 annual report from the Financial Stability Oversight Council, acknowledging the potential financial stability risks inherent in the private credit market, including opacity, credit risk, liquidity risk, and increasing interconnectedness with banks, insurance companies, and other institutions. Number 8. On July 15th, Erica Williams, chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, resigned and departed on July 22nd. Williams' departure comes after she staunchly defended the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board against a provision in the budget reconciliation bill that would have folded the organization into the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Ultimately, the U.S. Senate parliamentarian ruled that the provision could be removed from the bill because it proposed a policy change rather than a budget change in violation of the Byrd Rule. The provision had been supported by many lawmakers, and SEC Chair Paul Atkins expressed optimism that the SEC could carry out the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's functions during a May 20th SEC oversight hearing before the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government. Williams has served as chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board since January 2022, having been reappointed under former SEC Chair Gary Gensler in 2024. Her term was set to expire in 2029. SEC Chair Paul Atkins publicly stated he accepted Williams' resignation. Reports say Chair Atkins asked Williams to step down. Williams said in a statement, "The PCAOB plays an essential role in protecting the investments and retirement savings of workers and families across the country while helping to ensure our capital markets remain the envy of the world. With high economic uncertainty increasing the risk of fraud, the PCAOB's mission is as important as ever. It is critical the expert PCAOB staff continue to be empowered to carry out their work of ensuring American investors are protected." Number 7. On July 21st, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission announced that George Boddick would serve as acting chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And on July 23rd, SEC Chair Paul Atkins solicited candidates for all 5 PCAOB board seats, including the chair. Boddick is a certified public accountant and became a PCAOB board member on October 25th, 2023. Prior to joining the board, Boddick served as the director of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's Division of Registration and Inspections, where he oversaw the registration and inspection of all domestic and foreign accounting firms that audit public companies with securities that trade in the United States, as well as all broker-dealer audits. Boddick previously served in various roles at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, including as its director of the Office of International Affairs, special advisor to former chair James Doty, and deputy director of the Registration and Inspections Division. Earlier in his career, Boddick was a senior manager with PricewaterhouseCoopers. Each PCAOB board seat is associated with a set 5-year term, and any nominee selected by the commission to fill a seat may serve the remainder of the term associated with that seat. If eligible, the SEC may reappoint a board member to a second full term. The chair position may be filled by either a CPA or a non-CPA, though any member who is a CPA is eligible to serve as chair only if that individual has not been a practicing CPA for 5 years preceding appointment as chair. Each of the 5 seats have terms expiring between October 2026 and October 2030. In his statement soliciting nominations to the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, Chair Atkins noted that the Commission's review of the PCAOB's annual budget is an important element of the Commission's oversight of the board, and he said he expects the SEC to conduct an evaluation of board members' compensation. Lynn Turner, former SEC chief accountant who was actively involved in the legislative process leading up to the drafting and passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which established the PCAOB to oversee the audits of public companies, commented, quote, "With the SEC announcing they are going to investigate and likely lower board member salaries, look to significantly lower the staffing budget, and consider replacing all board members, it raises the question as to why a competent applicant would want one of these jobs, as it will last only about 3 years," unquote. Number 6, in a July 23rd status report that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission filed in response to a court proceeding challenging the Commission's 2024 climate change disclosure rules, the SEC said it did not intend to review or reconsider the rules at this time. The SEC also requested that the court end the suspension of the rules and decide the case, but it left the door open for future action depending on the court's ruling. In April, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit directed the SEC to provide a status update in the ongoing litigation concerning the climate-related disclosure rules. Specifically, the court asked the SEC to advise whether it intends to review or reconsider the rules. If it has decided to take no action, the court ordered the Commission to explain whether it will adhere to the rules if the petitions for review are denied, and if not, why it will not review or reconsider the rules at that time. In its status report, the SEC wrote that the court's decision on the legal issues in the case would help determine the scope and need for further rulemaking. A major issue in the case is whether the Commission had statutory authority to issue the rules, and a range of views on that topic has been presented to the court. The SEC report notes that a majority of the current commissioners believe that the Commission lacked statutory authority for the rules, but acknowledges that the courts have the final say on statutory interpretation. While saying a new climate disclosure rulemaking would likely raise similar arguments and be challenged in court again, the SEC's filing also acknowledges that it is possible that the Commission would engage in further action related to the rules, including recommendations to replace, rescind, or modify them. But the SEC filing adds the outcome of the litigation and the reasoning of the court will bear heavily on the Commission's next steps with the rules. SEC Commissioner Carolyn Crenshaw criticized the SEC's report as wholly unresponsive. She said a rescission, repeal, or modification of the rules would require notice and comment rulemaking with the benefit of economic analysis and a public, transparent process. Commissioner Crenshaw said that instead of engaging in this, the SEC is asking the court to carry water that we should shoulder ourselves. Crenshaw added it has effectively ignored the court's order and thrown the ball back to the court. Number 5. On July 1st, the D.C. Court of Appeals ruled that proxy advice does not qualify as a proxy solicitation, a categorization that had been the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's statutory basis for prior rulemaking on proxy advice. The decision is the latest action in a long legal battle between Institutional Shareholder Services and the National Association of Manufacturers. The ruling says that, in sum, the best reading of Section 14A, grounded in the ordinary meaning of solicit in its statutory context, is that the term refers to a request for proxy authority or a directed plea to exercise such authority in a particular manner. The ruling adds that the proxy voting advice rendered by a third party for a fee falls outside that definition. It is simply a recommendation. The court concluded that the SEC's efforts to expand solicitation to include proxy advice is not supported in the law's text, and its adoption of that definition in its 2020 rule was contrary to law. Institutional Investor Shareholder Services spokesman said, "We're pleased with the appellate court's decision, unanimously affirming last year's district court decision and our longstanding view that the provision of independent voting advice does not constitute a proxy solicitation." Spokesperson added, "As the opinion notes, proxy voting advice is simply a recommendation and is already subject to regulation under the Investment Advisors Act." When the Commission originally issued its proxy rules in 2020, it interpreted the term soliciting proxies under the Securities Act of 1934 to include providing proxy voting advice. In November 2021, the SEC, under Chair Gary Gensler, rolled back other provisions in those rules that would have required the advisory firms to give their proxy voting advice to their clients and companies at the same time, but it did not drop the provision in the rules that classified proxy voting advice as a solicitation subject to proxy rules under the federal securities laws. Before the rollback, Institutional Shareholder Services challenged the SEC's classification of its advice as a solicitation. The Council of Institutional Investors filed a joint amicus brief in October 2020 supporting that lawsuit. The brief was co-signed by the California Public Employees Retirement System, California State Controller, the California State Teachers Retirement System, the CFA Institute, the Colorado Public Employees Retirement Association, the Comptroller of the City of New York, the CTW Investment Group, now SOC Investment Group, and the Los Angeles County Employees Retirement Association. The Council of Institutional Investors and its co-signing members asserted in their brief that there is no legal or economic basis for the Commission to classify proxy advisors as proxy solicitors, which makes them subject to onerous filing rules. Also, the CII brief argued the conditions that advisors must meet to qualify for an exemption from those rules may impair their independence and harm long-term institutional investors. Number 4, on July 17th, as the debate over increasing the regulation of proxy advisors continues to be pursued by corporate trade associations and their lobbyists, the Council of Institutional Investors published a brief to refute many of the claims that corporate trade associations and their lobbyists are relying on to muster support for their efforts to increase the regulation of proxy advisors. The 6-page brief from CII explains how investors use proxy advisors, how much influence proxy advisors actually have over investors' voting decisions, how often errors actually appear in proxy advisors' reports, how proxy advisors manage any possible conflicts of interest, how more regulation would affect the market for proxy advisor services, and how proxy advisors approach transparency about their practices and methodologies. CII Executive Director Bob McCormick stated, as CII's recent survey showed, many CII members rely on one or more proxy advisors to help them cast informed voting decisions, but don't follow their recommendations. He added, given the continued claims leveled at proxy advisors to justify more regulations, we thought it would be instructive to provide guidance on how investors actually use them and how proxy advisors actually operate. Number 3, on July 24th, Glass Lewis filed suit against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, arguing that provisions in Texas Senate Bill 2337, which place onerous disclosure requirements of proxy advisors, are unconstitutional. The suit also requests that Texas halt enforcement of the law, which is due to take effect September 1st. SB 2337 requires that any advice on a proxy proposal that is even partly based on an environmental, social, or governance factor must be accompanied by a warning notice to clients with the statement that the advice provided is not solely in the financial interest of the shareholders of the company. Another provision requires a similar warning notice to clients, companies, and the Texas Attorney General whenever different advice is provided to different clients that have not expressly requested services for a non-financial purpose. Proxy advisors also must decide and disclose which of the differing recommendations was in the financial interest of shareholders. Glass Lewis argues that these provisions violate the First Amendment and the Dormant Commerce Clause, are unconstitutionally vague, and try to preempt the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which instructs Glass Lewis clients, the fiduciaries who invest for employee benefit plans, to consider all relevant facts. In a statement, Glass Lewis said it had no choice but to take swift legal action to try to block enforcement of the law. The proxy advisor called SB 2337 unworkable and said it exposes both our business and our clients to unwarranted legal and regulatory risk. Number 2, on July 28th, Institutional Shareholder Services filed suit against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton in an effort to block enforcement of Texas SB 2337, which, as I just indicated, places onerous disclosure requirements of proxy advisors and is due to go into effect September 1. In its brief, Institutional Shareholder Services calls SB 2337 blatantly unconstitutional and an affront to the free market system. The proxy advisor says the law burdens ISS's speech based on its content and viewpoint, and then compels ISS to publicly disparage its own opinions. Institutional Shareholder Services says this is an anathema to the free marketplace of ideas guaranteed by the First Amendment. In addition, the brief argues that SB 2337's labyrinthian requirements are riddled with undefined terms, making it difficult for ISS to determine what is required and facilitating arbitrary enforcement by the state. Institutional Shareholder Services asserts in its brief that this confusion makes the law unconstitutionally vague under the 14th Amendment. In a declaration related to the lawsuit, Global Head of Investment Stewardship Solutions at Institutional Shareholder Services, Lorraine Kelly, says as a result of the Texas law's lack of clarity, compelled statements, significant compliance costs, reputational harms, and significant penalties imposed for violations, it is likely that Institutional Shareholder Services will consider curtailing its recommendations, reducing or even eliminating certain services involving Texas companies. Kelly says this would affect not just ISS's proxy advisor services, but also ISS's broader services that provide various government ratings, she says. Kelly adds that, in addition, the false statements required by the statute would call into question the quality of ISS's proxy voting services and products altogether, thereby threatening significant harm to ISS's business. And my number one most significant development, U.S. corporate governance capital markets regulation for the period from June 30th to August 4th, 2025, occurred on July 23rd, when the U.S. House of Representatives, in a 381-31 vote, passed H.R. 3357, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act. The act would require companies with multi-class shares to disclose information to help investors understand disparities between stock ownership and voting power. Long championed by the Council of Institutional Investors, the legislation would require firms in multi-class share structures disclose information about the total shares and total voting power of each person who is a director, director nominee, or executive director of the company, or who directly or indirectly holds 5% or more of the total combined voting power of all classes of securities entitled to vote in the election of directors. Although some multi-class companies voluntarily provide some of this information currently in their beneficial ownership tables, many do not. In remarks on the House floor, Representative French Hill of Arkansas, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, acknowledged that while dual-class structures are important for certain business models, they also raise questions about transparency and shareholder rights. Chair Hill said the bill, which was introduced by Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, right-sizes this issue by requiring companies to provide clear information on voting power, especially where insiders and significant shareholders share outsized influence. That completes my monthly U.S. corporate governance capital markets update. If you have any questions regarding any of the issues discussed, please feel free to email me at Jeff, Jeff, @CII.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney. Thanks again for listening to the Voice of Corporate Governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.